So today we have with us our honorable friend, host, scholar, and wonderful human being, Charles Upton. It's an honor to have you once
In what
again.
order, I'm
And
not sure. Those things belong.
well, thank you so much for your time. And I, this sort of discussion today and what we'll be talking about is more about your personal life. Um, you know, from childhood onwards. I personally am interested. So this is why we're here today. And you have full creative control as to how you would like to share what you'd like to say and start off with. So before
Well,
further ado, please.
okay. Earlier you mentioned something about how I came to Islam, and that's a convenient framework because, it brings in a bunch of different events and eras of my life with a little form to it. So, huh. There's a number of different roads that led to Islam for me from extremely different directions. Um, I was raised in Marin County, California, which is sort of, well-to-do bedroom community of San Francisco, California, across the Golden Gate Bridge. And it was a strange place because it was, in a certain way, it was an ideal place to live and grow up for the first years I was there. It didn't end up to be that way, but but at the same time, there were as with every place, there were difficulties, that there were, you know, hidden conflicts. I suppose the conflicts in my family were very hidden, and that they were not serious, but there was that undercurrent, and there was a sort of an undercurrent of unease in this amazingly easy and beautiful place. Um, which I think is what led to the one of the things that led to the counterculture in the United States, because I'm a baby boom generation of that generation, and I certainly followed out the counterculture part of my generation for longer than some people did. So because I wanted to see everything that was involved in that very interesting development. But if the hippies, which I definitely was at one point, had not felt that something was like this can't last. You know, uh, we would not have so many of us chosen not to follow, the professional path of our parents, but to do something else. You would get people uh, whose parents are professionals and who had a college degree, but they said, I don't want to do that. I want to be a carpenter, you know. Or I want to do something else, or I want to move to the country and grow my own food or whatever. There was a sense this is all very well, but it's not going to last. And I don't know how articulate that was, but that's the way it was. And because my parents' generation went through an amazing experience in the United States, you know, remembering the Great Depression where everybody was poor, it was just incredible. The entire economy fell apart and poverty, unexpectedly spread throughout the country, which no one was, there were plenty of people that thought, well, World War I is over and it's the roaring 20s and everybody's getting rich and we'll all just get in the stock market will go up and up and up, you know, and it crashed. And that was a shock to many people. How can this happen in the United States? Well, it's always happened in the United States and everywhere else, but that wasn't the feeling that people, that's not what they expected. So to go through that and then what pulled my parents' generation out of the Depression was essentially World War II. I mean, World War II made everybody rich again. in a solider way, which wars since then have not really done. But there was a huge national effort. People who, like poor Southern blacks who might even have been sharecroppers, ended up being able to move to the West Coast and get jobs in the shipbuilding industry, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and live in Oakland and Alameda and places like that, and ended up even buying their own little house, and that was inconceivable, unbelievable that that could happen, And after World War II, everybody was well-to-do. There was the biggest middle class this country had ever had. You could have an entire you could have a home, two cars, children that you could send to college and all this on one salary. And, the wife could stay home and make a home and raise the kids so they would not be raised by television and whatever else. And it was it was phenomenal. Um, and so my parents' generation sort of thought, well, because I was the baby boom, which I was produced by the exuberance of having won World War II, where everybody wanted to have kids and and have a you know because we were on top. And my parents' generation believed that we were the most privileged generation in history. So how could there be anything wrong? Well, in a certain sense, we were privileged, but we also knew somehow the future, this was the peak and was going to be all downhill from then. And it was all downhill from then in so many ways, decade after decade after decade, more economic stress, more social disintegration, more, so many things, so we instinctively felt, this is not going to last. So I'm, those, who were more or less in the hippie side of the generation said, we're going to, you know, instead of becoming doctors and lawyers and buying our own home and being well-to-do, we're going to become survivalists. We're going to prepare for the crash. And of course, the crash took a long time to appear, but it was starting to appear in little ways. After the 60s, the economic expansion of the United States was still, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, there was a huge economic expansion of a kind. More people became fabulously wealthy, but it didn't have as broad a base. There were fewer people who were becoming the rich, and other people were getting left behind. And we can really see that today. Definitely. You know, I mean, Elon Musk is a trillionaire or was until recently, and how many people are homeless? That's the way this country has become. So, in that context, my generation appeared and had a very strange reaction to the world that we come into. And our parents' generation didn't understand that at all. Why do what's the problem? Everything, we've given you everything. This is ideal. What? Well, it wasn't ideal because there were nuclear weapons, and here comes Vietnam, and here comes, the civil rights movement and all that, social conflict. And so, they didn't understand that, and we didn't quite understand it either because, we didn't have anything to compare it to. But that's that's the way it was. And so one of the things that the hippies did, those who were interested in what was called the spiritual revolution, because at the same time, so many different influences were converging at the same moment. I mean, uh, political, artistic, religious, all coming together. And one of the things that was happening was that, first, an understanding of the different religions of the world was appearing. My parents' generation, what would they know about Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam? It was not relevant. It was not there. But for us, this was all appearing. First it was appearing in books. You hear the scriptures and the writings of the great saints and sages of all the religions, not just Christianity. And and then when the 60s really started off, somehow representatives of different religions and actually different mystical or esoteric schools, or schools of yoga or schools of meditation or schools of, would appear in the United States. I didn't ever have to travel the world to find spiritual teachers. I just there in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they all came to me. They all came to us from everywhere. Not necessarily the best that the Islamic world or that India had to offer, but some of them were entirely valid. Swami Muktananda, for example, was a true Baba. He was the chela, the student of the great yogi Nityananda. So there he was, and these people had come. And then what came first? Let's see. War is a great chance for cultural interchange. You know, it's a very strange thing. You're trying to kill these other people, and yet the influence of their culture comes deep into your culture if you're fighting them. This very often happens. So for World War II made Japanese Zen, a living force in this country to a certain degree through the Beat Generation and their interest in Zen. And then later on, when the hippies came, this is the time when Hindu teachers were appearing of all kinds, yoga teachers and such and such. And um, the next wave was,
Apart from the ones that you mentioned, do you want to give some more names of, those who were coming forth?
well, yeah, I will get there.
Yeah.
Then the next wave was probably Tibetan Buddhism, and this had to do with China had conquered Tibet, the Dalai Lama had to flee to the West, and all of this, and so many Buddhist teachers from that tradition came. Out of Vietnam came Thich Nhat Hanh, who was I believe, yeah, he was Mahayana Buddhist. That's right, from Vietnam, and so war and social disruption created a migration of the world religions around the world, and so many of them came to San Francisco. And other people, yeah, but the last wave, to a certain degree, I would say was Sufism from Islam. There had been Sufis before, Hazrat Inayat Khan, for example, who was not as Muslim as one would hope, because he was trying to translate his teaching into Western terms. You know, okay, but he was an important figure. Another important figure was the man we called Sufi Sam, who was Samuel Lewis. Grew up very near to where I lived in Marin County, and he grew up in Fairfax, California, in Marin County, and yeah, he's one I met. He's the first Sufi I met. So, but it seems like the more legitimate Sufi orders, or the more orthodox Sufi orders, were appearing the last in the series of waves of religions from other parts of the world. And I wasn't ready to make one of these choices when the original Hindus, the Hindus were coming through. The Zen practitioners came through earlier. When the Hindus were coming through, well, I wasn't ready to make a commitment to a spiritual path. And when the Tibetan Buddhists came through, I was almost ready. You know, I was investigating a teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, who uh, many many of those, some of the major members of the Beat Generation, and a lot of younger people who were following them, became students of Chogyam Trungpa. So I got very close to that, very close, including dreams and, definitely feeling that influence. But that passed, and I did not make the commitment. But then somehow, when the Sufis came, that's when I said, well, it's time to make that commitment. So it was Sufism that brought me to Islam. And I think that was what you could say for American Muslims of my generation and a little earlier, and I'm sure later to a degree, uh, the main pathways to Islam for Americans were, for Black Americans, it was the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad, which was, certainly not Orthodox Islam, but it was a step in that direction. That was, the first form of Islam that Malcolm X embraced before he understood that this wasn't entirely Orthodox, and and he became an Orthodox Sunni Muslim. And the same could be said for Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer, heavyweight champion. So that was the way a lot of Black people were coming into Islam. Whereas for white people like me, it was more Sufism, and it was coming out of the counterculture and saying, well, which one of these many esoteric mystical paths will work for me? And some people said, well, how about the Sufis? And there were simply the Sufis were available in San Francisco. There was a publication which was called Common Ground, which was a large catalog, which you could get on the street, out of a newspaper dispenser, and it had the list. It came out periodically, had a list of all of the many, many, many page after page after page of different religions and different therapies and different methods of changing your consciousness and different methods of healing. And it was a huge, the catalog of all the different offerings which were available to and produced by the baby boom, counterculture of the baby boom. And one of those was the Nimatlahi order out of Iran under Dr. Javad Nurbaksh. And at that
Mm.
point, my
The
wife and I,
Namatalahis.
yeah,
Okay.
and at that time, my wife and I were also investigating, the traditionalist or perennialist school, the books of Fritjof Schuon, and the school considered to be founded by René Guénon, who are all Muslims or at least nominally Muslims. You have to say in some cases, but uh, but who are sort of taking the religious spectrum of the different religions and interpreting it on what was perhaps the highest level that it had yet and probably has yet ever been interpreted, which didn't last, but I will get to that. So since and we were uh, starting to become familiar with some of the people who were active in that movement in the traditionalist or perennialist school, including Professor Houston Smith who was a well-known professor, probably the best well-known professor during his later life of comparative religion, and also Syed Hussein Nasr. And Syed Hussein Nasr had a list of supposedly Orthodox or Orthodox enough Sufi orders, and the Namatalais were one of those. So I said, well, looks like this is one of them. What can I know about how am I going to evaluate a Sufi Tarika? But listening to Dr. Nasser, he says this is legitimate. Here it is. Why do I do it? And I did it because during the years of the counterculture, 3 or 4 years, let's say, I had become so dissipated in my spiritual. I mean, if you read all the scriptures of the great religions and the writings of the saints and this, and at the same time you're taking LSD and other psychedelics. And there are so many spiritual teachers coming through. You can be a member of a different religion every week, and just, making scenes. Let's listen to Swami so and so talk. Let's listen to Tibetan Buddhists. The Gyalwa. One of the most powerful events was the Black Crown ceremony of the Gyalwa Karmapa, head of the Kagyu lineage of the Tibetan Buddhists. Very powerful event in San Francisco, which, what the Tibetan Buddhists do, there's the true initiation into, Tibetan Buddhism under a particular teacher at a particular school, particular method, true initiation. But then there's a sort of a secondary, you might call it initiation, where a certain amount of the influence of that tradition is made available to anyone who wants to come, whether or not they make a commitment. And those are called empowerments. And there will be an empowerment based upon a particular Buddhist deity. And Buddhist deities are not exactly gods, they are qualities of enlightenment or something, but they're represented as, as gods, more or less. And so, empower and the most powerful empowerment I ever went to was the Black Crown ceremony. So that did some things, but it's getting all these transmissions. But after all of that, and self-directed psychic experimentation, with dreams and with even dabbling a bit in my idea of magic. I was introduced by my teacher, first teacher, and I won't call him a teacher because he was a Beat Generation poet, Lou Welch, who was, had some very profound things to say of a spiritual nature in his poetry and was truly a master poet. But on the other hand, he was an alcoholic and ultimately committed suicide. So this is the kind of ambiguity of light, mixture of light and dark that we were getting, So things were very chaotic. Well, he introduced me to uh, Carlos Castaneda, who was very influential on the counterculture because he had supposedly found among the Yaqui Indians of Mexico, a shaman or sorcerer that he followed, and he wrote books about it called Don Juan Matus, who may or may not have actually existed. We don't know, but these books were extremely influential, and I was introduced to him, and I met a lot of different people, but the influences were so heterogeneous and so chaotic. And I'm going to say, I can't do this anymore. I can't, what religion will I be this week? Or what next strange influence will I subject myself to? I mean, you can't go on like that. And plenty of people tried to and really damaged themselves. And I won't say that I was not damaged myself. I was doing Kundalini yoga according to the form of Yogi Bhajan, who was a Sikh teacher. And that will definitely, blow up your nervous system in various ways. I mean, it was put you through experiences you wouldn't have had otherwise, because if you knew what you were in for, you wouldn't have touched it with a 10-foot pole. But oh, let's try this. Boom. And so very chaotic stuff. So when the Namatalahis appeared, I just said, I don't know who these people are. They may not be perfect. They may have problems, but I have no way to evaluate them according to anything I really know. Dr. Nasr says they're legitimate, so here they are. I'm going to do it. And when I did that. My wife and I were initiated into Namatalahi Tarika, and she didn't stay that long because uh, the other Pukara, or as they're called in Iran, the dervishes, they did not get along with her very well. They did not treat her very well, actually. So anyway, she left, but I stayed for 20 years. And I
Was
just,
it, sorry to interject, was it
yeah.
predominantly males in the
Well, no,
early,
no, it
no,
wasn't just, it wasn't that was an element. That was an element, but well, you could say it's predominantly males, or you could say it was predominantly people working for Microsoft, Americans working for Microsoft. And there were plenty of Iranians too. It's about half Iranians, half Americans. Uh, and although the Iranians, I think, were fading away at the end, fewer of them were there. But there's just a certain type prejudice that you will get in California against people from Appalachia and the South, which is where my wife is from, Kentucky, which is where I'm living now, and a very unconscious prejudice. Yeah. But it had to do with somehow she got on the wrong side of the Sheikh al-Mushaykh, who was there to initiate people. And then they didn't have a fight, but he was treated her for some reason in a very insolent manner. He's talking to me and he says, "We searched the world, looking for sincere seekers like you." And I said, "Oh yeah? Well, that's great." Immediately I distrusted him when he said that. And then he turned to her and says, "And you? Who the hell are you? What are you doing here?" That attitude. So that attitude spread throughout the group. That's why that happened. I don't know. I th- the Sheikh al-Mashaykh was attempting a Sufi method, which is I'm going to, you know, talk to this guy and inflate him and make him feel great about himself and bring out his ego, bring out his nafs, and then I'm going to puncture the balloon, because later he tried that, but I saw what he was doing, and it didn't seem to be relevant one way or the other. Whether you flatter me, whether you puncture me, I don't care. You know, so here you see, Sufi methodology, Sufi psychology, if you want to call it that, applied in a rather, uh, you know, not a very conscious or relevant way, just, sort of mechanically. But what was heavy about the Namatalais, I just sat there for 20 years, hardly speaking, going there twice a week to the Hanukkah in San Francisco and just, doing my Zikrullah and just sitting silently, And it was like it was an intensive um it was like a primer, a primary, uh, introductory course to Sufism. Certain principles were emphasized over and over and over again. And that was probably good
you
because I
stayed
need
with them
to,
for 20 years.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Because I said, I'm not going to run around. I'm going to say, who am I to say, I don't know if I like this one. I'm going to go somewhere else. I said, I don't know enough to say this is wrong or this is right. I'm just going to, I have to stay one place and collect myself and not, subject myself to infinite number of influences. So for good or ill, at least I will do that. At least I'll be willing to stay one place and do one practice. And that was very important for me, and then there's certain principles which I think are really true in Sufism, and you see through them the difference between Sufism and Hindu or Buddhist yoga, for example, which is you know Islam, you know submission to the will of God is paramount. It's even more important than achieving union with Him. If He wants you to be to not have the sense of union, if He wants you to feel separate, if you want, then accept that too, because He knows better than you. You can't say, I'm in this for union with Allah, and I hope I get that. You say, okay, it's natural to wish for union with the truth, and if you love Allah, it's natural to wish union with Him. But to say, well, that's what I'm going to get, maybe you're not going to get that, or not right away. And so learn to follow His will, not yours, even when it comes to the desire for union. That was important because the religious paths of Buddhism and Hinduism, uh, or at least a lot of them, had to do with achieving states. I mean, you with Kundalini yoga, you achieve different states. The Kundalini force rises through the chakras. In each chakra it hits, you have a different world of experience and all this and then. And or you in Zen you're hoping for Satori. In Hinduism you're hoping for Samadhi. Hinduism, Hindu yoga, Hindu contemplation can be defined in terms of a number of different samadhis, and which samadhi have you achieved and which comes first and all. Now that's legitimate in its own context, but that's not Sufism. Sufism says, I've heard this a number of places, spiritual states are gifts, not acquisitions. Oh, did you get the state of intimacy? Oh, congratulations. No. It's more important to accept what Allah gives and see the unique lesson in every state, whether it's expansive or contractive or anything, scattered or recollected. You see that there is a lesson and there's a potential purification of the nafs in every one of those states. So don't say, oh, I'm in this because I'm looking for my favorite state. You forget your favorite state. What does Allah want? And that was important. I mean, if there's one thing I learned from them more than anything else, that's probably it. So although, there were difficulties because they were withdrawing from Islam slowly. What happened to the Sufis? The Sufis were persecuted by the Iranian revolutionary government. They came to the West, and that's why the Iranian revolutionary government suspected a lot of them of being Western agents because they had all these Hanukkahs in Western nations. And for all I know, they might have been right in certain circumstances. I couldn't say, but I see why they thought that. And but the Iranian dervishes that I knew were beginning to identify Islam with the revolutionary government that was oppressing them, but they were Sufis, which is something else. That's not what Dr. Nurbakhsh's books said. They all say you have to be a Muslim and follow Sharia to be a true Sufi. Yet that isn't the way it really was. There was a split going on, and no one was acknowledging it. And slowly, the Salat, which in Farsi and Persian is called namaz, was slowly disappearing from the Hanukkah, and finally it was discontinued. And I think that the Iranian dervishes thought they unconsciously identified the Iranian revolutionary government with the Arab conquest of Persia, which is a strange thing, but it's like there was a memory of, we used to be a great empire. We were conquered by these Arabs from the desert, and, a certain hidden resentment in the Persian, soul historically, and that was accentuated by, when the Ayatollah Khomeini came, and when the Sufis were being more actively persecuted, because Sufis have been persecuted in Iran a lot from time to time. Not, sometimes they will be historically very, very prominent and very established, and the Safavid dynasty came from the Sufis. On the other hand, the Safavid dynasty ended up to be so unpopular that after it fell, you couldn't even call yourself a Sufi anymore. In Iran, you had to use a different word. Uh, it was a very difficult history of Sufism in relation, to Iranian society and politics. So no, so that's why I spent 20 years there because I just had to do one thing. And that was, I did it until Dr. Nurbakhsh passed away in 2006, I think it was. So, yeah, I needed it. It was not easy, but when is the spiritual path ever simply easy? It's not. You're not in it for ease. You're in it for what you need, and Allah knows what you need. So that was one way of looking at how I came to Islam. I got two other ways of looking. One is the simplicity. I mean, Futraf Schuon, in one of his, I think his book, Understanding Islam, I think the first sentence is, Islam is the meeting between God as such and man as such. Just like that. Just that simplicity, and uh of course, there are always intermediaries. Every religion has intermediaries. The prophet is an intermediary, angels are intermediaries, saints are intermediaries. And when the Wahhabi Salafis, say no intermediaries, they tend to do a lot of damage. They destroy the tombs of great saints. They destroyed the tombs of most of the prophet's companions in Mecca and or in Medina, and almost did that with the prophet's tomb itself until they stopped. They wanted to say, there's only Allah, and they were very close at one point to saying, and this Muhammad character, it could have been anybody. He had to send the Quran to somebody, so he sent it to Muhammad. But don't concentrate on Muhammad. He was just a man. Well, he was quite a man. I'll tell you that. So, you know, difficulty in religion, but the sense, nonetheless, of the simplicity of the relationship of the soul and God without, and so I was raised as a Catholic, where you have the entire sacramental order of the seven sacraments as channels of God's grace. And I was very glad I was raised as a Catholic because I saw what a religion was, and I saw what a divine revelation was. But the Catholic Church, as I was in high school, was essentially deconstructing itself, which it did. It is not what it was before the 60s. It turned on its own tradition in an extremely destructive way. And there are more Catholics nowadays trying to return to that tradition, but I don't know if they're going to be able to find it. They don't know what they're looking for. I could tell them, but if it's not available, why should I tell them? Maybe it is available, but that's for the Catholics. But it's like because the Catholic Church was essentially falling apart, and the teachers. So all my schooling has been in Catholic school, from a nursery school and kindergarten through, you know, 8 grades of grammar school and 4 years of high school. That's all my formal schooling, and it was all Catholic. So,
So when did you start exploring the other traditions then? If you
well,
grew up in, were you
the,
dissatisfied?
the hippies came and they brought all that with them, and it was like 1966, 67 is when all of that started, you know.
Right. And you were about early
Well, I was
20s?
well, no, I was like 17 or
Okay.
something like that. And I remember one influence was, see, um, if you want to call it comparative religion, or the idea that we study all the religions because if you want to be a cosmopolitan, Westerner, you need to know all these things, and now they're available to us, and we should study them and expand our horizons. That was a very accepted attitude. Um, Starting back, it started in the 19th century, at least, if not earlier. And it really reached a crescendo in the 60s with figures like Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith. And that's the way everyone was thinking. And then and it was brought to its final fruition by in my opinion, by the traditionalist perennialist school, Fritjof Schuon, those people. They did it better than anyone, but mysteriously that was the end. It got to an end. It got to a place where, well, all right, now we know about all these religions. Now what? How can you pick just one religion and follow it if you know all about all of them and see all the wonderful things about all of them? You can, so in other words, people became connoisseurs of different religious qualities, but they couldn't make a commitment to a particular Tarika or a particular way. They could not do that.
So
It
do
was
you
hard.
see that as an issue?
Um, yeah, because people could not get to the depth of the traditions they were looking at. Because they were looking in too many directions at once. And then what happened was, uh, and of course, Fritjof Schuon was developing these rather suspect ideas of saying religion is, he was so impressed that he had such a profound idea of all the different religions, not quite realizing that every hippie on the street knew at least half of what he knew, but he didn't know that. He thought we have the final and greatest teaching, and he thought there was a particular esoterism, esoteric level that allowed you to understand all the religions, and there was quintessential esoterism which transcended all the religions, and you can't. There's nothing there. You can't do that. Allah has sent no quintessential esoterism to us. He sent these revelations. So he went as far as he could, and then it was over. And it was over at the same time when many people of different religions were saying something on the order of, we don't just want to be part of the religious smorgasbord of Western so-called spiritual seekers. We're not going to play that game. Christians were Christians, Jews were Jews, Muslims were Muslims, and there was a rather swift turn toward reasserting separate religious identity, and that was sort of the end of the 60s. If that's what came after the 60s and 70s, which could be called the era of comparative religion. No, no, it didn't last, and that's more where we are today, for good or ill. It's it does no good, to follow your own religion, but the main way you follow it is by hating other religions, or by looking down on other religions. How does that do you any good? You're supposed to follow your religion, not waste your energy looking down on other religions. What and of course the Quran accepts that other revelations are peoples of the book. And the prophet said, I am no new thing among the prophets, and those who believe in, God and the angels and the last day, et cetera, will be all right, and no harm will come to them, and they will not grieve. And that's all in the Quran, you know. Um, but the need to reassert separate religious identities after an excessive period of comparative, or syncretizing, the idea of synthesizing all the religions, too much of that, there was a reaction, and so you had a re-embracing of religious identity, which for some people helped them get deeper into the tradition. For other people, just created unnecessary conflict, unnecessary pride, you know. So this is more or less as I see where we are today.
Um, a thought came to me only after that when you were with the Namatulahis, did they have Shia leanings? Were they, was it part of their doctrine to believe in the
Not really.
imams?
Not really. Not really. I mean, there were a few. Oh, that there was one exercise I was given which had to do with, the 14, I forget what it was called,
Masumin?
the prophet's
The
companions.
infallibles?
Yeah, the infallibles and yeah. And there was a little of that, but basically one of the quotes that we read in the books was, I'm a Sufi, far be it from me to be, an asinine Sunni or an idiotic Shiite, you know. Um, there's a lot of pride, a lot of wounded pride in those Sufi. There's a long tradition of persecution and of turning around and saying, you may kill us, but we are the true lovers of God, and a pride and a sense of being of the elect, very strong in the Namatalahi order, and um, it just sounded strange to Western ears, saying we are the elect of the elect of the elect, and one of our greatest um, virtues is the virtue of humility and virtue of self-abnegation and virtue of self-annihilation, because you got to be of the elect to be self-annihilated. I said, wait a minute, this was a contradiction to me, but I understand that different cultures have different historical experiences and different ways of construing things. And so I said, well, I could see, this must work for Iranian Sufis, from time to time. It just sounds strange to Western ears. So
Now, this aspect of pride, do you think that this is a common sort of feature in the various Sufi orders?
I mean, what do I know of the various Sufi orders? I know of the hippie Sufis who didn't particularly have that pride. These are the ones who followed Sufi Sam. Sufi Sam, Samuel Lewis had true initiations. He was of the Chishti order, and he had some initiations as well, I believe, from some Central Asian um, tarikas. Uh, but he was the apostle to the hippies, and so there wasn't particularly a great deal of pride. I wouldn't say in that. And then there's Hazrat Inayat Khan's lineage. I don't know enough about that to say. Uh, I also one of my experiences, but before I joined the Namatalahis was, uh, excuse me, Jalaluddin Loris, who was the son, I guess, of Suleiman Dede, who was the last caretaker sheikh, whatever that may mean, of the Mevlevi out of Turkey. And he'd moved to Fairfax, the same town where Sufi Sam grew up. And there might have been some influence of Sufi Sam that brought him there. But so I met him, and he would do these magnificent Mevlevi Samas with all the dancing and the turning, in Fairfax, and it was lovely. It was powerful. I mean, here in Lexington some years ago, a troop of so-called Mevlevi whirling dervishes came through. Well, and these people were just they were the tourist Sufis. They were the ballet folklorico of Turkey, as I call it, and they'd put on a sema, so to speak, at an auditorium, and it didn't work. It was obviously, it was a pantomime, Whereas what Jalaluddin Loris did in Fairfax, California was powerful, extremely powerful, and beautiful Ottoman music. Wow, love that. What he did once, he said, "Well, everyone come, we'll all be whirling dervishes." So he invited a lot of people to. It was a gymnasium at the College of Marin, and he just said, and we thought we were going to go and watch the whirling dervishes, and he says, "Come, come, you have to be part of it, you know." And for with the power of his attention, which was miraculous. He took these people who had never done anything like this before or knew what it was and formed them, like scores of people into a huge wheeling mandala of Sufi dance. And he just would do this, do the, no, 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 do this, running around. And he did it. You know, he choreographed us out of nothing to do this amazing. So we were the we were the performance. We didn't come to watch it. We came to be it, and we had no idea that was going to happen. And and that's my one and only experience of Mevlevi turning, and I learned something from it. It was very powerful. So, uh, he was, you know, but the pride, I don't know. I mean, I think pride. There was certainly pride in Fritjof Schuman's group, no question about that. No question about that. And also in the Namatalahis. But I wouldn't say that the Sufi Tarikas are necessarily, affected with pride, particularly more than any other spiritual group. It's what if you feel that you're in touch with something sacred and you're in touch, inshallah, with absolute truth. Um, if your nafs gets a hold of that idea, it's going to create pride. It's going to create towering pride, and that's a danger that's always there in the spiritual life. That's what I think. Not necessarily more with Sufis than anybody else. So, so. And there's another one. Why did I become a Sufi? Why did I become a Muslim? Well, when I was 4 or 5 years old, or maybe 5 or 6 years old, I had a dream. And I call it the dream of my life because it was a lucid dream, in which you are aware that you're dreaming. And every major change of my life that I've gone through, I go back to that dream and I see different aspects of it. That was the story of what this life was going to be and what it was. And the story is this. There was this huge room, like a cubicle room, and it had dark wood panels, and it had, red, I won't call it wallpaper, but sort of almost velvet, you know, squares on the different sides of the room with the dark wood paneling around them. It was a very big room. In this room, it was very ornate and very, very opulent. And in this room were all the people that I knew in my life, or all the people I ever would know. These are the people of my life. They were all there. And there was it wasn't a banquet, but there was some, party, whatever going on. And uh, there was entertainment. See, let's see that there was a chandelier, large crystal chandelier. There was a piano, and the entertainment for the guests was provided by two figures who looked like North African marabouts. How you pronounce that? Marabout. They were dressed in white jalabas, hoods with, you know, cloth across the lower part of the face, and their faces were black. They were blacker than Negroes. I wouldn't call them necessarily Negroes. Their faces were just black as coal, dressed in white jalabas, and they were providing the entertainment. And the entertainment was there was something that I, as a child, called a horse, but obviously it was a camel. You know, it was a dromedary, it's a one-humped camel. But I said, "Oh, that's a horse," because I didn't know what a camel was, I guess. But what they would do is they had rifles and they would shoot this camel and it would die and then it would come back to life. And the different guests could talk about different ways they wished it should die and come back to life. Oh, I want it to die like this, and then they say, okay. And then, they were taking requests, And so they took a request for me and I sort of showed how I wished the camel to die when they shot it, which it would, and as if I were the camel, I was, twisting on my legs and collapsing and making a sound of a camel. And I said, "Well, do it like that." And they said, "Okay." And they shot the camel or the horse, and that's how it died, and it came back to life. Yeah, that was the first part. Then over to the left, there was a few steps up, and there was a little room leading to other rooms behind. And in that room, there were, I think, green or red plush chairs, maybe red and green, and there was a lamp with a yellow green lampshade with yellow polka dots, and then in there, and then and so I went in there, and then beyond that room, everything was black and white, and out in the big opulent cubicle room, everything was in brilliant color. But I go back there, it's all black and white, shabby halls with crumbling plaster, old buildings and not in good shape. I went through there. Then I came out into the beautiful opulent room again. Then I went back a second time. Then I came out a second time. Then I went back a third time. And the third time when I came out to the beautiful room, everything was jet black, black. Couldn't see a thing. And I was terrified as a child. And I called for my parents because that's when I started to know, I realized I was dreaming. So I said, well, if I call my parents, they'll wake me up and they'll get me out of this place. And so they did. And I woke up. So this is an interesting dream. This is so much, I've been looking at the symbolism of it and in some of Dr. Nurbache's books, I found some of the symbolism. There's one called a blackened face in both worlds, which is essentially total annihilation. You're annihilated from your experience in this world, but you don't say, now I can go to the next world and that'll be my world. You're annihilated there too, whatever that may mean. So the blackness was like it could be if it is not dealt with correctly, it could be despair, it could be spiritual despair. But in a deeper sense, it's al-Dhat, it's the black essence of Allah, which is the light that's so intense that you can't see it, that you only see it as blackness. That's what it was, and so it was an annihilation. And what's interesting is now the Sufi Tariq I'm with is a branch of the Alawiyah, although we unfortunately do not have a sheikh now because of various scandals with the last sheikh, and no one else has emerged, which is sad, or maybe it's not sad. Who knows? Maybe that's what's supposed to happen. But those figures in the white jalabas and the black faces, very much like North African, many North African Sufis. So and the Alawiya order is a branch of the Shadiliya, which is all basically North African from Egypt and across to Algeria. So So my present connection with my present Sufi order was predicted in that dream I had about 5 years old. So so
And you mentioned the geometrical shape of this space that you saw yourself in as a square.
yeah, I mean it suggests the Kaaba, certainly. And it was a cubicle building, a cubicle room, yeah. And actually, over to the right, there were some glass doors, and out there was a street with traffic. So that was like the outer world, you know. And so, and I think sort of all the strengths and weaknesses of my spiritual life appeared in that tree too, you know. So m maybe, it's interesting that the death and resurrection or fana and baka were being enacted as entertainment. Well, that was very much like the 60s counterculture. There's profound spiritual teachings, and yet in another sense, they were entertainment. It was the Hollywood version of spirituality. And some people got very serious and true about it, but others just took it as, wow, look at that one. That was it. Whoa, you know. I wonder what happens the next time I drop acid. I'll see an even different one. So, but there's something about the simplicity of Islam that because in Catholicism, for the sacraments to be administered, except the sacraments of baptism and matrimony, in which the ministers you don't need a priest to baptize you, and you don't need even a priest to marry you, because the man and the woman are the ministers of the sacrament. So, but for the rest of the sacraments, you need a priest. And whereas with Islam, when you're performing salat, that is a sacrament in every meaningful way, according to the Catholic definition, which is defined as an outward and visible sign of an inward grace. Well, that's what it is. And you're the priest, and every Muslim is the priest, and a priest is not necessary. That an imam, is important, and the prayer leader is important, but not necessary. So, in Islam, I got somewhere the sense there's me and Allah. And if there's just you and Allah without the intermediary, which is what the priest or what Christ is for Christians, just me and Allah, that is what brings you to the doorstep of fana. Because how can you exist in the presence of absolute reality? There's absolute reality, which is everything, absolute and infinite, and then there's me. I'm sorry, there's no room for you. There's only Allah. And that sense of there's only Allah spoke very deeply to me, you know. Um, and that's what allows Sufism to be truly, if you will, openly esoteric. You hear very deep teachings coming out of Christianity, particularly, like Eastern Orthodox Christianity. But there's always a Froedtert Schuon said Christianity is an exoteric religion. The deepest esoteric truths are manifest let's say, in Eastern Orthodoxy, in the liturgy, um, in the iconography, profound, but it's always a little bit, what do you say? It's a little bit dramatized. It's a drama. It's a sacred drama, but it's drama. Whereas, in my understanding of Islamic Sufism, The presence of Allah is your annihilation. And then, strangely enough, you're still there. How do you explain that? That's what's called baqa, um, subsistence within Allah. But that closeness to Allah being the sense not only of your own annihilation as something that's going to happen or is happening, but something that's always been true. How can anything else claim reality? Nothing can claim reality in the presence of Allah. And yet Allah is generous, and gives his reality to every conceivable thing. And he conceives of all things, and to everything he conceives, he pours his reality into them, as to the extent of their capacity. But the only way to know that is by going through, in the presence of Allah, who am I to exist? So that's probably in an inner way what attracted me to Islamic Sufism is that quality. So
At that time, first of all, thank you for sharing that intimate dream of yours. And on another note, I would like to reach out to you off video about a dream that you brought me back to when I was in grade 7
oh,
about being in a space very symbolic and similar to what you're speaking of. And I've
hmm,
talked about this in my poems, and yeah, I would love to share that with you. I'm just
yes.
curious, what about the Bawa Mohiuddin Fellowship? Was that something that was post or around that time, or was that?
Well, it was there. I never became very closely involved with them, but there was another publication. There was Common Ground, which was like a newspaper, stapled to newspaper format. Whereas there was before that there was something called the Spiritual Community Guide, which also had a list of all the different religions which were popping up, and one of them was the Bawa Fellowship. But at that point, to the Sufis, he was called Guru Bawa because it was known the Sufis. I mean, the hippies would respond to the word guru, and after all, was he not from Sri Lanka?
Yeah,
Yeah, so he was in the Indian cultural world, and so they would say, okay, we'll call him Guru Bawa. Only later, what was he, known as a Muslim, as Bawa Muhyiddin. Um, yeah, well, he was important. I went to his mazar once in Pennsylvania to meet with the poet Daniel Abdul Hai Moore, who is no longer with us. And I just remember all I know about Bawa is that I was once doing a copying job at the Kinko's copies in San Rafael, and suddenly he popped into my consciousness and said hello. And I wasn't thinking about him, and nothing I was copying had to do with him. He just went pop. So that's all I could say about Bawa. But so he was around, yeah.
and did you ever have any encounters with? Because I'm not sure about the time frames and the timelines, but Shams Fredlander.
I never did. No, I mean he was
No.
certainly. Um, we knew of him basically as hippies before, I joined the Namatalais. Yeah, he was, a familiar name, but I never met him.
Okay.
So, and it's funny, it was a question I have in my mind is what is happening with the Tarika form? It seems like there must be great teachers, but they have withdrawn I mean, in the 60s, they were there, whether they were charlatans or, you know, imperfect teachers or true saints, who knows, but they were all up front. And now they've stepped back. And because, the Sufi orders aren't running around proselytizing so much, except that there's a branch of the Shadaliya order uh, that they have a farm in Pennsylvania, and they're the ones who followed. I forget his entire name, but he's Shadili Rifai um, Murshid, who was just call him Sidi, who was he was the Muslim, as I understand it, guardian of the Dome of the Rock. Who had a little you know building or shrine he lived in actually on the Temple Mount. So, he also came to the West and preached to the hippies and started his these people are um, they're following sort of a hippie or New Age form of Sufism, where there are many, public workshops and get together for a gratitude day and come to our event and this kind of thing, which is not like traditional Sufi groups at all. But there may be a place for that. Who knows? Um, there's a woman who is part of them who's worked with me as a healer, um, who seems to be very very powerful as a healer. Um, Yet, she just sounds a little heterodox from here, but who knows? Who knows what's going on? It may be. Oh, and the other thing is that there are people I'm getting in touch with now. Someone's interviewing me on my, let's see, I've got a book here, actually. This is a different book. Um, see that? I can't see my,
Right.
you see the whole,
Yeah.
um,
Signs of the Great
but I,
Jihad.
I cannot see my whole thumbnail there. Um, this is called The Science of the Greater Jihad, Essays in Principial Psychology, which is chapters taken from a number of my books. And he's interviewing me now, chapter by chapter, because he's a Muslim therapist trying to set up in Manhattan. And through him and through just things that have been going through my mind, I wonder if there are elements of Sufi teaching that really can be shared with the larger ummah at this point, because there's certain elements of the ummah in this country who are becoming more sophisticated, and know, you know, they would be able to understand certain Sufi doctrines of the nafs and things like this. And he's attempting to do that. And the people at the Cambridge Muslim College are also attempting to do that. And I don't know exactly, how far they've gotten or what their direction is, but uh, this is teachings that used to be kept within the tariqas, and because nobody else outside was interested, and because there were religious authorities who could become suspicious, if you said certain things that didn't sound orthodox, even though they might have been right out of Al-Ghazali, people would still distrust. So Sufis kept it to themselves. It also allowed these teachings to deepen and to become more intensive for a group who wanted to dedicate themselves to this kind of practice and this kind of spiritual development. So that's the way it was. That's the way it still is to a degree. But are some of these teachings going to come out and really be relevant to the larger, Muslim Ummah? I don't know. I just feel that possibility, but I wouldn't say that because I don't have the authority or the insight to say, now it's time for the Sufi orders to spread their riches abroad. to to all the people outside Sufism because they'll get a lot of pushback even now, certainly, no question about that. But so, I'm just going to remain ambiguous and uncertain on that point, as you can tell, I am. So because things are certainly changing in the world, and spiritually and in every other way. And Allah always has, he says, every day I'm performing some new work, you know. So there are new works that he is preparing and performing that have to do with the difficulty and the darkness of our times. And we just need to know that and to be ready to hear what he might say. He's not going to send a new Quran, obviously, and those of us who may hear things that he says are not going to be prophets in any sense like Muhammad was. We're not talking about that kind of pretentious pretensions, but um, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, did say the Arifun, the Arifs, the Gnostics of my community are like the prophets of the Bani Israel. So that's interesting. And also, he said, dreams are the 46th part of prophecy, which is also interesting. So, in other words, there is, the door is not closed. The door of, the basic doctrines and forms of the Islamic faith, that's closed. That's done. That's not going to be revised. That's where innovation becomes a real problem. You think you can revise the essential principles. And yet there are things that are coming through that will help us deal with the difficulties of these times. I'm convinced. So,
There seems to be a lot of reiteration. So, do you see that as a rebranding or necessary due to the era we're in right now, compared to maybe other forms of Islam that were considered to be, uh, expected ways of following? So, there
well,
seems
I
to
mean,
be a
I can't speak for all the different tendencies that are operating within Islam now. I mean, it's too complex. And if I were to hazard a guess, I might be wrong, but certainly I believe I can say this much that there's an attempt to re-envision the religion for our times without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, without betraying the central principles, and that's a difficult thing. And of course, some people throw out the baby with the bathwater. We are we're the New Age mosque, are we the lesbian mosque, or we're the extreme liberalizing tendency. And then, of course, most of the mosques in the United States were founded by the Wahhabis and funded by the Wahhabis. How that's going now with what's going in Saudi Arabia, where the Wahhabis do not seem to have their same old influence, but I don't know much about that. That's just the sense I'm getting you know, but the Saudis have gone for technocratic modernism in a big way, and that's a problem, I think, for any religion who goes in that direction. Um, so, things are changing. So I'm just saying, let us let us listen. Let us listen. Let us understand that Allah has not stopped speaking. He's stopped, the function of the Rasul is not going to come back. The Rasul has done his job, and the forms of Islam are given us, and they will be here until the hour. But and as for the Nabi, there's going to be no complete Nabi as Muhammad was. And yet, the Arifun of the Prophet's community are like the prophets of the Bani Israel. So, you know, mm, uh, let's not close the door on any of this, or come to a conclusion about the way things are going to go or should go. Just realize there's more to come. That's all I can say.
So we be open to see what's coming forward.
Yeah, yeah. Without grabbing for it, without saying, "Ooh, ooh, ooh, what's the new, Islam?" It's, I can't wait. Don't do that.
Mm.
It'll come in its own time, in Allah's own time. And you just need to be sure that you don't miss it when it appears.
There are many spiritual seekers who do have a desire to explore the various traditions. And I wouldn't say they're sort of in that mindset of taste testing, the connoisseur kind of experience.
Yeah,
That's not what they're
yeah,
seeking, but rather just really wanting to understand the world and the people around them, the traditions, the common ground, and so forth. So, what would you
yeah.
say to that?
There were people like that among the hippies as well,
Right.
and I ended up to be one of them, I hope. Uh, so I don't want to say that, that there was just a sort of an easy, um, an easy promiscuity of looking at many different things without the necessary seriousness. And even though, Joseph Campbell, for example, did a lot of great work, on different world religions and world mythologies, and uh, he brought forward a lot of, and Carl Jung was even important in this, because he saw there's certain archetypes that he felt were manifesting, in whatever religious or mythological or worldview you have, these archetypes would manifest. So there was a common ground. That was his sense of a common ground. Yeah, I mean, let people take it seriously. Let them learn. I will never say it's no longer time to learn this. I'm just going to say, um, it was too easy for my generation to say, now we know all this stuff. It's all ours. We've got it all. You know, we know all this, and we can believe all these different things, and it's wonderful. And that created a dissipation, which ultimately wasn't good for people. But that doesn't mean, what is more important, really, than understanding who the people of the earth are. We are of the people of the earth. We are humanity. We possess the fitra. And after all, Islam is called, you know, al-din al-fitra. The religion of primordial essential humanity. The Quran says, everyone is born a Muslim in that sense, not in the sense of the Muslim religion as opposed to some other religion, but in the sense of, everyone is born as a servant of Allah. And then their parents will make them a Christian or Jew or something else, you know. So yeah, we because there's a tension between needing to follow a particular way and seeing the multiplicity of ways. And it's not easy to see both of those at the same time, but it's necessary. This is what we have to do. Um, because this is the truth. And this is what the prophet tried to, the prophet was certainly, he had his followers and the Sharia was developing and this, but when he founded his political entity at Medina, it was supposed to be a federation of the different peoples of the book, and this did not pan out, because of the pressure from the Quraysh and because certain of the Jewish tribes bet on the Quraysh against Medina and lost, and there were some very hard things happened. But you could see that that was the prophet's desire, that was his wish, that there be a federation of the peoples of the book. So there's a certain sense in which that is true, and a certain sense in which that can still be true, as long as that does not um, does not dilute the essence of Islam as a particular faith, because like I say, on the tree of religion, the nourishing fruit grows in the branches, not the trunk, you know, right? So find your branch, and pick your fruit, and you will be nourished. You have to understand that. But look at all those other branches. So, and it was very interesting, of course, to do, along with Dr. John Andrew Morrow, the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world, which I did for 7 years. And there we have had a way and still have a way, because those documents are being used by a lot of different people in ways that we once in a while get wind of, but we're not tracking. But Dr. Morrow's scholarship, with my help, we launched those into the world and into Islam, and it was it was really deep to do that during the time when ISIS was coming up, because those documents were as if designed to directly counter ISIS, and that's why they appeared at that moment. It was
Oh, it's
providential.
like the antidote.
Yeah. And
That's how I came across your works from that point onwards, when I came across yours and Dr. John Moore's works. I remember getting in touch with you both, and ever
yeah,
since we've been in touch.
yeah.
But that was a huge eye opener for me as I was living in Saudi Arabia. And basically, ISIS and the Taliban and all of these neo Wahhabi movements and extremist groups everybody is pointing their fingers at Saudi Arabia for exporting, this
Yeah,
ideology. And
yeah.
living there, I was like, okay, what do we do here? Like, we have a homegrown problem, which is obviously global. And taking the covenant of the prophet, peace be upon him, the specific one that is considered to be not considered, but it's the one to the Christians of Saint Catherine's, the monastery,
Yeah,
the
the
monks,
Ashtinama,
right?
which
Right, the
pretty much
Ajtiname.
the first and the paradigmatic covenant.
That's right. So that
Yeah,
that was something that that was very pivotal in bringing about that information in Saudi Arabia.
yeah. I mean, it was amazing, that I was allowed to work on that. I mean, because Dr. Morrow had done this amazing research on these documents, but he didn't quite see what he had done. He was. an associate professor in a little technical college that didn't know what the hell he was doing, and he was keep asking me the sabbaticals to do this research and saying, "What's this all about? What do you?" So, but when he first appeared, it was, my press was Sophia Prentice Publications, and that became, or the publisher of that press also partnered and became one of the leading forces in Angelico Press, which is sort of it's a traditional Catholic press that also does some things on a slightly wider angle than Catholicism. And so they showed me Dr. Morrow's work, and I was so amazed that this should appear at the very moment that ISIS was coming. And I said to my publishers, "You've got to do this. I'm sorry. I mean, we'll hear you will not take no for an answer. You've got to do this. This is the most important thing you will ever do." And they said,
Absolutely.
and they were going, "Well, I don't know. It's you have this activist attitude here, and we're just depressed that does spiritual writing." And I said, "What about committed activism? Isn't that spiritual? Come on, this has got to." And so and I got back to Dr. Morrow, sort of speaking for them, and I said, "Well, we don't have an awful lot of resources to advertise your book, and we don't have an advertising budget to speak of, but I think we can make a movement out of this." And we did. And he did all the work, first, in terms of research and scholarship. And then he was the one that ran around the world, and went to spoke at Oxford and Cambridge and the House of Lords, and spoke in Belgium to the EU, and later went
And
to Iraq, and he did all of that legwork too. But I was sort of the catalyst because I saw what he had done. He didn't even know he'd written his own book. He thought he was, well, what I'm doing is doing a translation of this other man's, I forget who it was, scholarship, who has been writing among this covenant, and can we write a translate, will you be willing to publish a translation that I've done? And I said, "Wait a minute, this is your book. You just haven't finished it yet. This is your book. You are the one who's doing this. And I threw the light on him, and he said, "Oh, I think you're right." And he went for it, but that was 7 years right there. And who knows what would have happened if it wasn't just for my recognizing what he'd done, because
wow.
he was too oppressed in this, dead end academic job, and nobody understood what he was up to. And I was the one that saw. So I can say that was and then, my background, because, I've been a peace activist, in the past, in the 60s, we were against the war in Vietnam. In the 1980s, I was with a Presbyterian church. My wife and I were elders of a little Presbyterian church. They were working with Salvadoran refugees, who were coming to this country because, um, the troubles and the revolution and the wars in El Salvador had partly to do with the United States, because we were training the death squads. We were training, uh, people at the U.S. War College. We're training these people as insurgents against the communists or the leftists in El Salvador and Central America. And, terrible things were going on. And we saw that it was partly due to the actions of the United States that people were fleeing El Salvador and coming to the United States. And so we in the churches who had been involved in the peace movement probably back in the 60s, some of the same churches, against the war in Vietnam, I said, "Well, it's our responsibility to help these people because it's our fault that they have to flee here. So we've got to take them in." So we call that the sanctuary movement, because that was an old medieval rule that a criminal fleeing the police, if he went to a Christian church, Catholic church, at that point, um, the secular authorities could not touch him. He could take refuge, he could have sanctuary in the church. There may be people who actually became monks because they said, well, do I want to be a hunted criminal, or should I just be a monk and, sit here where I'm safe? I don't know. It was a very interesting tradition. And so we were sort of more or less reviving that tradition. Um, so, I had that kind of background, and working with some revolutionary groups who turned out to be problematic, as revolutionary groups do. This was liberation theology, was the framework um, that we're working through.
Are you still active in any of these particular
Well, no, no,
groups
no.
and
The last
movements?
I thought I would never be an activist again. And then the covenants came, and suddenly I was an activist. And I was a better activist than I
Mm.
ever been before. That's the one that worked. The other ones were just half-assed, ambiguous attempts to do something without a solid basis. But when you realize that it has a prophetic basis, and this was the wish of the Prophet Muhammad, and he said that the covenants, um, with the Christians, between the Muslims and the Christians, were dictated to him by Allah. So I said, and they'd been forgotten by history and almost forgotten by Islam. And so, that gave me a base,
Absolutely. And
really
the
be an,
rise of extremism,
yeah,
therefore.
yeah. But when you're talking about the liberation theology movement in Christianity, it wasn't as legitimate, because this was saying, well, we can make a synthesis between uh, monotheism, between theistic religion and atheistic communism. Why not? Well, I'm telling you why not, because it can't be done, you know. But there was a sense, you know, uh, that Christianity has to be more serious about dealing with actual social problems. That's all very well, but Christianity and the Catholic Church lost a lot of its spiritual essence doing that. And trying to make an accommodation with communism. And there's still that tendency in the Vatican, which has been devastating to the church. So it didn't work as well. It didn't work in Christianity because that was the ambiguous and sort of dishonest framework it was coming from. Whereas in Islam, it worked because this is the will of the Prophet. This is what he was doing in Medina. It was right in line with Allah's will in that sense. So, you know,
Absolutely.
that's why it worked when I did it. And it's interesting. Dr. Morrow was also involved in the revolutions of Central America. He was a teenager. I guess I was in my 30s, but he was a teenager running around Guatemala, during those revolutions and those troubles, because he's a Métis, he's half Native American and half European ancestry, and so he identified with the Native Americans. And there's so many, Indians who were getting killed in those revolutions in Guatemala, and so I don't know his whole history there, but he was down there
And he also
looking.
identified with Moorish
Yeah.
Hashemite roots in his research. I
Oh, yeah.
recall that as well.
He's got a lot of
Um,
interesting research and books that I haven't read, but
yeah.
more
Uh,
books on the covenants,
I have
and
friends who have found his books in Iran, and they're
wow.
just, there. Is interesting. I just want to mention this, that the work that you both, you know, did about the covenants, that's basically unprecedented, unprecedented. And so much so that, just making this point, that the same place where extremism basically was, you know, happening in, due to the Wahhabism, um, and this ideology, the Ministry of Information the book that we published, which included this covenant with the permission of Dr. John Morrow and yourself, the Ministry of Information said, we want you to publish this.
Oh.
And that's happening in Saudi Arabia. So
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia, I don't, I'm not up with what's really happening in Saudi Arabia, but I know that the Wahhabi establishment is not on top in the way it was not too long ago.
yeah, I
Not
mean,
that,
the divorce has happened, basically.
yeah, yeah. But what you have you have mosques in this country whose whole tone has been set by the Wahhabis, and
Exactly.
they're not particularly, it's not going to be as easy for them to change, or
Yeah. And likewise globally.
Islam as they know it.
Malaysians are complaining. It's all over. It's all over. The damage is quite deep
Yeah,
because it's their mosques that they established with these imams proliferating and radicalizing communities and making them intolerant human beings.
yeah. But there are younger Muslims coming up often in of the professional class, who have a different view, and you know how they're ultimately going to affect the mosques and their leadership. I don't know. I mean, I'm not up with that. I have to talk to one of my Sufi brothers who goes to the mosques in Manhattan and Queens as well, and he can tell me how it's going. So
Mm.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, it was unprecedented. It was providential, and it's interesting to realize you have all these ideas of how you think things should be. You know, um, you think your best of intentions are good, and this is what will bring peace, and this is it. And so you pray to God and say, please empower my agenda. You do not pray to God, people that don't do this as much as they should. What is your agenda? But Allah's agenda appeared just and unexpectedly. And thank God I could have missed it. I could have just said, oh, who knows this one more weird, who knows what that is. But I saw it, and I think that was providential too. The eye of my heart was open to the covenant. Um, so yeah. And if that can happen, more can happen. When I was saying something is coming, if that can come, what will come next? You know, um, because certainly as the political, economic, environmental pressures of the world become more and more intense, um, people who have not lost their faith completely will turn more completely to Allah. There's no place else for them to turn. And that will bear fruit somehow. We have no idea how, but we got to get ready for that. I mean, don't imagine how you'd like it to be, or don't imagine even how you think your own actions will affect society and history, or how you hope they will affect society and history. Not even that. Just listen. Listen for the next command, because the command is in a holding pattern above us now, and it will appear. Will appear.
When did you meet Jenny?
Oh, I met Jenny in the 70s. Was like 74 or something like that, in San Francisco, and she basically fled from an abusive family in Kentucky and went to San Francisco. And it was amazing. She was able to get, now in the 60s, people went to San Francisco to become hippies. In the 70s, they went to San Francisco either to become poets, which was a big thing, maybe be a poet in San Francisco, or to come out as homosexual. That's why people were traveling to San Francisco in the 70s. So she traveled during that time and was a poet. And she was going to some poetry workshops. She went to one with Jack Gilbert, who was a very, very fine poet who's passed on now. Um, and it was a funny time because it was after the explosion of the 60s. The 60s were so collective. Millions of people were hippies or thought they were hippies and thought they were spiritual seekers and whatever, taking drugs, whatever it was. It was very, whereas, and that sort of crashed. And one of the things that caused the crash was feminism, which basically, destroyed the party atmosphere of the 60s as much as anything else. But just basically, you can't keep living a dissipated lifestyle like that without dying or going crazy or ending up in jail. And so it didn't go on in the form of maybe 4 years there in the late 60s. And so after that, people were more introverted. And the poets that we knew in San Francisco were all reading Carl Jung. They were all pop Jungians. And this was the framework they were using to sort of give a context for their poetry. There was something called the deep image school of poetry. And it was like people would go to dreams or active imagination in the Jungian form and to get images for poetry. But what was interesting is they were more introverted, but it was a time when people were interested in each other's in actual individuality. The poets wanted to find people who were different than them and different, like unique, quirky kind of people, and those people were recognizing each other and supporting each other, even though they were very different in some other ways. So, Jenny was as different from San Francisco culture as you can imagine, being somebody who as a child was, basically a country girl and living in Appalachia and, then came out of her parents were upper middle class in the middle of a very poor area, teachers, but there's a lot of abuse in the family, and so she came out, but she was recognized as a unique, interesting kind of person, and other people were unique, interesting kinds of persons, and they didn't have to be the same kind of person. Less than with the hippies. Even the hippies is sort of, we're all supposed to be hippies, and we're all supposed to have long hair. We're all supposed to. It was more collective, whereas the 70s in San Francisco, there's a short time when that appreciation of people's unique differences was there, and that's just what she needed. That didn't last long either. But so I met her at a poetry workshop, Jack Gilbert's poetry workshop in the first half of the 70s. Yeah.
And so you were both at that time interested in Islam, or?
Well, she's the one that she actually, that's the other thing that got me connected to Islam is her. She said at one point, I'm going to become a Muslim. Now, I don't know where that came from. I'm going to do it. You know, um, I said, all right, I guess I'll do it too. It could be so it was, and it was funny that I didn't remember her influence until you mentioned her. But that was just as important as any other influence. And yeah, that was interesting. Then after the Nematolahi's treated her in a rather shabby way, she decided, well, I'm gonna, I said, well, look, you're interested in infrastructure and those people, why don't you? join his group. And she said, oh, they won't accept me. Oh, no one will believe me. And I said, oh, come on, you can do it. And so she connected with the Schuon group through Houston Smith and Sayed Hossein Nasr. And she was doing that for a while. And then it came to her that she needed to be Eastern Orthodox Christian. And this was difficult because she knew if would ask Dr. Nasr, can I convert to Christianity? He would say no, because that's apostasy. You can't do that. So I said, what'll I do? So I said, why don't you just talk to Schuon, who's supposed to be Nasser's superior in the Mariamia Tarika? Just go over Nasser's head and talk directly to Schuon. And Schuon says, "Oh, certainly. You can convert, no problem." And then so Nasser had to go along with it. It was a very funny time. And then, well, Houston Smith wanted to follow her into Eastern Orthodoxy, and but at that point, Schuon had passed on. So when he asked,
Houston Smith, is that Abdul Qadir al-Sufi?
um,
The one who moved to South Africa?
no,
No.
no, Houston Smith, it's well his story. He was the son of Methodist missionaries in China, grew up in China, and when the revolution came, they moved, back to the United States, and so he had the background in Chinese culture, which was sort of it was very interesting. He was talking about, Chinese culture had Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism were all accepted, all entirely Chinese, entirely part of the culture. Um, you know, Confucianism was the civic religion. For the weddings, you would go to the Taoists, and for the funerals, you would go to the Buddhists. And and then he was a Christian missionary as well. And I guess in his own experience, the Christians were pretty well accepted, although certain people looked at them, of course, as foreign devils, and so they had to get out. So when he was here, he became involved with the Vedanta Society.
Okay.
And, so this set him on a life of what I call serial monotheism, where, he would get very deeply involved in religion and practice it for years and years and years and learn it, you know, and then something else would call him, and he was practicing, I think he was, basically practicing that westernized form of the Vedanta from the Vedanta Society. And then on his travels, he heard the adhan from the muezzin somewhere. I forget where it was, and this touched his heart. He said, "I have to go in that direction." So, at that point, when we knew him, he was a Muslim, sort of uh, nominally once again, not not a Muslim like as many people would be, but that was his, and he connected with First Schuon's group, and they were nominally Muslims as well. Although I would say Sayyid Hossein Nasr is certainly more than nominal. He's a true Muslim. So, uh, and yeah, and so we knew him, and then he wanted to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy because he went. We took him to the Cathedral of the Blessed Virgin Joy of All Who Sorrow on Geary Street in San Francisco, and this is where the relics, the sort of mummified body of Saint John Maximovich, Archbishop and wonder worker, was enshrined in that cathedral, and that is an extremely powerful place. The spiritual energy generated by that place is amazing. St. John Maximovich was like, I don't know if you know the Padre Pio of the Catholics, but he was like the Padre Pio of Eastern Orthodox. He would levitate during divine liturgy. Uh, many miraculous healings attributed to him. He was clairvoyant. He had all these powers. And at the same time, he was an actual Archbishop of San Francisco, but he was weird because he'd go around barefoot and do things like this. And he was very close to, in Eastern Orthodoxy, they call some people, some spiritual pilgrims, fools for Christ. And the fools for Christ are pretty much the same thing as the Malamatiya in
Oh,
Islam.
they're like the Qalandars.
Yeah, I like the kind of, but I mean, a little, perhaps a little less outrageous, but more just appearing as fools. Like I'm just a poor idiot. Um, Dostoevsky's figure in his book *The Idiot* of Prince Mishkin is sort of in the spirit of the fools for Christ. But in many ways close to the Malamatiya, and uh, but yet he was an actual archbishop, which you just don't have that. He was a hierarch in the official Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which were the old um, white Russians, anti-communist old white Russians, some of whom were still alive, in San Francisco. And he did such miracles. He did miracles after his death. um, he would appear in people's dreams. Somebody would be, this is before he died. Someone would be in a hospital and close to death, and didn't wanted to get in touch with him because he was known to be such a great healer. And then suddenly he would just appear in the hospital room and bless the person. The person would get better, and he would walk out again. And we don't know what that means. Was he clairvoyant and he knew and heard that that person was in need? Was he actually bilocating? We don't know. But there are many, many amazing stories about it. So we brought Houston Smith to his cathedral, and Houston, we brought him in, and he came out again. He says, I'm going to go back. And he turned around and went back in because it was so powerful, the influence. And so he says, after that, I'm going to ask Dr. Nasser to if I can convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. And of course, Nasser said no. And Shun was not there for him to go over Nasser's head as Jenny had done because he'd passed on. So, mm, yeah, I've got in my book, this is all about me. This is my autobiography, giving myself away. So like 650 pages. And it has many stories that I'm telling in this interview are all written up here. So yeah, so the whole thing of after our work with the Central American refugees in that little Presbyterian church in Marin County, Jenny and I spent a couple of years going around the New Age, seeing what the New Age was all about. And we did harmonic convergence. I'm not going to even say what harmonic convergence was. It was a big event of the time in the New Age world. You can look it up. And then after that, Jenny found the books in a bookstore for Shoshone, and that just changed our lives. Suddenly, we saw a higher conception of a lot of the things the counterculture had been involved in, but on a much higher level, and much more authoritative, much clearer. And so we were pulled toward the traditionalist world. And Jenny was initiated after the Nematolahis in the Mariamia Taraka by Dr. Nasr in Washington, D.C. And then we would drive back from California about once a year to go to his majlis uh, in the D.C. area. And so, a lot of pilgrimage through different religions. I mean, I was never considered becoming Eastern Orthodox Christian, but I sure learned a lot about it from Jenny and the different churches she went to. And like as I say, I wouldn't have become a Muslim if it wasn't for her. So I was following her for a while. Um,
Is the Maria Mia still active?
well, it still exists. I don't know how active it is. I don't know what active would be. There's still people in Bloomington, Indiana. There are
Mm.
people who consider Michael Fitzgerald to be basically the de facto sheikh, even though he doesn't call himself a sheikh. Um, and after the Schuin scandals, which I won't go into, but you can look up the Schuin scandals nowadays. I'm sure AI will tell you all about them. Um, Basically, Schuin says, "Well, I'm retiring as sheikh, so my khalifas or my muqaddams now are on their own." And so there were at least three different groups that the Maremia split into. There was the original group in Bloomington, where while Schuon was still alive, Bloomington, Indiana. Then there were the followers of Martin Lings, you know, Abu Bakr Siraj al-Din, Martin Lings. And there was another group, and I forget who the other group, who the leader of the other group was, but and there is, I forget this man's name, but there was some group that was following a sheikh from Iran, so it was very complicated, and it was starting to break up into different, I won't call them factions, but into different discrete groups. And some of those are still around. I mean, I don't know whatever happened to Martin Ling's group after he passed on. Whether I really don't know. The traditionalists have a Facebook group, you know. So,
That we're both on.
oh yeah. So, but I'm not following what they're doing. It just seems their sense was, even though of course they wished that Schuon's books would be read by everyone, and then they wanted more influence and they wanted more recognition from even academia, but they basically didn't admit that. They just said, well, this is quintessential teachings for the few, and only the few will ever be interested in them. And so, and so they got the sense that, well, the final truth has been told. It's all in the books. Here it is. And now we fold our hands and wait for the coming of the hour. That's all we do. And so they all along were like this, but they became even more clubby and sort of isolated, um, and unwilling to speak, or uninterested in speaking to anybody outside of their own little circle. Is the
Right.
impression I get.
Now, after your most recent book, Going Forward, uh, after perennialism, um, did you get any personal lashback and
Well, the first edition was canceled by
right?
Michael Fitzgerald. After that, no, I just took certain things out, and I think actually it was a better book after he said take those things out, because I didn't need to repeat, the various scandals,
Sure.
and I didn't repeat them at much length anyway, but I said a few things. Oh, you can't say that. All right. So, in other words, it forced me to concentrate more upon Schuon's doctrine and words, which is really what needed to be looked at, because he's so brilliant in so many ways. That you're bowled over by the brilliance of his writing, the profundity of some of his insights, that you don't notice the contradictions. You don't notice the places that, in this paragraph, he was the most intelligent man you've ever read. In the next paragraph, he was an idiot. But you don't notice that because you're dazzled by his facility with expressing metaphysical ideas. So, going into his writings and saying, now, wait a minute, can we really say this? Or does this, if he says this, doesn't it contradict what he says over here? It's a thankless task to do. And not a lot of people are going to be interested in following it, but I felt I had to do it because I had spoken so highly of Schuon and used his ideas in so many of my books. I just had to say, well, I don't want to end up leading people astray here either. I've got to show the other side, you know.
Right.
So, you know,
So with this recent publication, did you have people approach you on this particular book?
no,
No.
no. I mean, in that world, everybody, you know, there are people who ended up saying, you know, I thought Schuon was God, but he turned out to be the devil. So why do I need to read this? You know, Schuon is. I don't want to hear his name. You know, and there are other people who say whatever Sheikh Isa said is gospel, and why should we listen to anything else? There was that polarization. You know, the
Right.
idea that these could be living ideas, which means if you have living ideas, you're going to deal with their ambiguities and the places where they may appear to be contradictory and you know, you're gonna wrestle with them and put them to work. But nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to do that. I mean, there's actually an anthology that's supposed to be have been supposed to be coming out forever that Bradley Malkovsky of Notre Dame University is doing on perennialism. But it's taken forever because some of the old perennialists around Schuon are dragging their feet and they probably don't want it to happen. They don't want to come
Right.
out and be in the same anthology with people who don't agree chapter and verse that Schuon is gospel, you know.
Oh, so is it sort of like a critique?
It's not just a critique. You know, there are people who, you know, different views of perennialism, some negative, some positive, some, you know, from recognized perennialists, some from other people who say, you know, I don't think this is a good idea, and putting them all together. But the Schuon's people or the perennialists in general did not want, are very nervous about doing that.
I can imagine. I
Yeah,
can
but you know,
imagine.
but it's
Um,
like if you're in a world where those ideas are alive for people and people are struggling with them, then you're gonna deal with disagreements, and you're gonna learn from the disagreements. You know, you may change your ideas, or you may get better arguments to refute the people that disagree with you. But at least you'll be in a living intellectual give and take, and they don't want that. This is
mm.
now, you know, sealed. It's done. It's sealed. No more need be said. That's it. You know, and that may not apply to everybody, but there are a lot of people who are like that. So,
They would be publishing it under their group,
well, no, this is
the separate.
Bradley Malkovsky. You know, he's hoping to publish it with SUNY. You know, with the State University of New York
Right.
Press. And you know, whether the submissions that have been hanging fire for 2 years or something are ever going to get written, and
Yeah, they have a
when it
lot
is,
of influence, right? So there could be a
well, yeah,
delay over there because of that. I
yeah,
mean,
that's true. That's
right.
true.
And I just recalled a specific incident while I was in Saudi. A friend of mine, um, I was gifted 3 boxes full of books from the Al Faisal library. And they said, give this to Alicia because she's the book lady, right? And I had this private library at my house there in Jeddah. And I was gifted these 3 books. And believe it or not, all of these books were concerning Sufism, Islam, and a lot of them were perennialist books.
Yeah,
And so they had, I believe, a relationship with specifically the Faisals, because this came from the Faisals. And I had heard because this specific branch of the Al Saud were more enlightened, very educated and refined in comparison to possibly the other branches.
yeah, and
And
the
so
Barnea
I
have
wouldn't
had
be
influence.
surprised.
They've had influence with, you know, I mean, they're kind of royalists with the royal
Yeah,
family.
yeah.
the royal family of
with
Jordan
the
as well.
Hashemites of Jordan as well, and
Yeah, and not only that, but with King Charles of England, you know. Uh,
oh,
yes, I mean, the real going traditionalist journal in the West now after Dr. Nasser's journal Sophia stopped publication is Sacred Web, which is published by a Canadian Ismaili barrister, Ali Lakhani from British Columbia, and that's that continues, and it's interesting because he has a wider approach to traditionalism and perennialism than anything that the Schuin people would do.
well,
He's
I'm down for the anthology. You want to just bring that to their attention. If there's a delay, I'm willing to be happy to see if they're interested.
if who was interested.
The anthology that you mentioned, which has been delayed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's delayed now because the submissions are not all in, but
Ah,
the next hurdle is to see if SUNY really wants to publish it.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. And
Yeah, right.
Plan B.
Yeah, well, okay. I will mention that. I will mention that to Professor Malkovsky, and see what he says. I just get back to him every 6 months and say, anything happening? He says, nothing yet. It's going on for quite a while. Uh, but yeah, Ali Lakhani, he's an Ismaili, which gives him a little more leeway as a Muslim than he would have if he were probably a 12 or Shia or Sunni. Um, yeah. So why was I bringing him in? I mean, that's what's happening. That is of interest in the perennialist world right now, as far as I can tell. In the English speaking world.
Right. And your
Yeah, but
biography. Yeah, just sorry to jump into back into your previous mention of your autobiography. How long did that take to um, how long were you writing that?
I don't know. I wrote it pretty quick for some reason. I guess it was, I mean, I didn't have to make it up. I know all these stories, and I must have been telling them for years because I wrote them down as if I'd told them 1,000 times. So maybe I did, maybe without quite realizing it. Oh, it took less than a year, certainly.
Less than a year.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And
Just
you embarked on this just recently, consciously,
well,
like to get the book out.
yeah. What book was this? What year was this?
Was it published in 24?
It actually says 25. It must be
25.
early last year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's funny because some people have gotten a little interest from Beat Generation aficionados, people who are interested in the history of the Beat Generation or may have known some of the beat poets like I did. And that's all they can see. They say, well, it's a really great book. It talked about the beats and the hippies, and then it was talking about all this other weird stuff, like all these straight religions and all that. I don't know. I wasn't into that part. It's amazing how people are split up. The people who are interested in the beats, that's all they think about. They're interested but it was very interesting to have known people in that generation, and to see what American spirituality, how it changed, what it was, in the beat poets and how it's changed since then. It's a lot of history. I wrote whole sections because I realized this is history. This isn't just autobiography. It's my view of these different historical eras. So, and then I have to mention there are people like first name that comes to mind is Jonathan Peugeot. A lot of these people are Christians, not all of them are, but there's a series of spiritual, psychological, social commentators who are almost to me, they're more of my like my intellectual horizon since the perennialists, and some of them went through the perennialists. These are the people who the door was open to these people by Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson, very influential guy who came up with a really intelligent critique of what you would say woke culture or established neo-leftist academic culture and what it's doing to our culture as a whole. Um, Very important guy who is now quite ill because he ruined his nerves taking tranquilizers because what he was doing was so hard. He was going against the flow. And he threw himself against the flow and he really got hurt. He may not come back to public life again because his health is so poor. But he's the one, I call him a berserker. You know that term berserker? It's a term from Norse, which in war, what the Norse soldiers would do, the Norse warriors would do, is there would be these people who were berserkers and they were warriors dedicated to death. And they would work themselves up into a battle frenzy, perhaps through taking psychedelics or God knows what they did. But then they would rush, according to some accounts, completely naked, except for their sword, in to the ranks of the enemy and kill like 40 or 60 people before they were killed. And after they did that, then the rest of the Norse, the rest of the Vikings came. It was very good psychological warfare. If every one of these guys is like this guy, we're doomed.
Like the suicidal bombers,
Yeah, yeah, in a way, but not quite.
kamikazes.
A different feeling. And so Jordan Peterson was a berserker against um, the darker sides of Western culture. And he did not protect himself. He was almost, he must have been saying in part of himself, if this kills me, so be it, you know. And he did get, severely damaged. But he opened the door for a whole bunch of other people whose names they're mostly Christians, not all. Jonathan Pajot, John Vervaeke, Ian McGilchrist, Rupert Sheldrake, um, Richard Rolhan. They're doing an amazing. It's interesting that they have an incredibly wide view uh, of religion. I mean, a lot of them, Jonathan Peugeot and Richard Roldan are Eastern Orthodox, but they have a view of world mythology and what they call universal history, which is so different from those little ethnic Eastern Orthodox congregations I knew when Jenny was going through there. These little self-enclosed, we're the Serbians, we're the Russians, we're the this, and they have all the breadth of somebody like Joseph Campbell, except they're doing it better than Joseph Campbell. But the thing is, they're those two, Roland and Peugeot are entirely Eastern Orthodox believers, and that is their basis. But from that standpoint, they can talk about Arthurian legends. they could talk about the dangers of AI, and they could talk about it. It's an amazing intellectual breadth they've got and relevance.
Quite
And
wholesome.
yeah, and John Vervaeke is a Buddhist, and Rupert Sheldrake is a kind of a Christian. Ian McGilchrist is a kind of a Christian. He's the one who has the most sophisticated idea of the of basically neuropsychology in terms of the right and left hemispheres of the brain, more sophisticated than a lot of people who sort of have a simplistic idea of that. But from that standpoint, he expands to being, a spiritual, um, teacher and social critic, on so many different levels. So these people are putting together spirituality, psychology, and social criticism, which is what I always like to do. And I remember Jonathan Peugeot. He's got a channel and sort of an empire, which he calls the symbolic world, and they do all
Right.
sorts of different books and videos and conferences. And I remember before he got too big to email, too big to contact, I contacted him and he said, "Oh, strange to hear from you. I haven't heard from him in years." I forgot I'd ever talked to him before. And he reminded me that I was the one who had introduced him to James Cutzinger, Professor James Cutzinger, who's also passed on, of University of South Carolina, who was one of Schuon's Christian mukaddams. And so, he went through, who was Eastern Orthodox, and then he became Byzantine Catholic, which is liturgically pretty much the same, except that they're in communion with Rome. And so he went through perennialism on some level before he got where he was going. These people don't particularly talk about the perennialists. The perennialists are damaged goods, Schuon's scandals. And I hear too many people say, perennialism, that's just the people who believe that all religions are the same and it doesn't matter which one you choose. So forget that. In other words, they reduce it to something much less than it actually is or was, and then they dismiss it. But perennialism, it's hard for people to talk about perennialism because, for a number of factors. So we will see if Professor Malkovsky's anthology comes out and what kind of response it gets.
Right. Interesting. There, I was wondering, did you ever incline towards Henry Corbin? Any of his works, or he died, I think, like 73. So I'm
Yeah.
not
Now, who
sure
who
if
are you
that's
referring to?
something. Henry
I didn't.
Corbin?
Oh, Henry Corbin. Yeah. Well, yeah, I've read his books. His book on Ibn al-Arabi and his book on what's it called, Temple and Contemplation. Yeah, and all his The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth. These are wonderful books. Wonderful books, and he's someone the Jungians will also appreciate. So
Can't really
interesting,
hear you
isn't
at
it?
this point.
Mhm. Can you hear
Can
me
you hear
now?
me?
Mhm.
You can. I can't hear
Yes.
you. We just, hmm. Okay, I'm back.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. But
Good.
yeah, but what I'm thinking is we can always pause in the next few minutes and then come back to this just in case, because I'm not sure what's happening in terms of the sound. In
Well,
case
yeah.
that happens, yeah.
Okay. So anyway, Henri Corbin, wonderful writer and very influential on me as well. And I was saying that the Jungians will appreciate Carbon because he wrote about the imaginal plane. The imaginal plane was, the Alam al Mithal was kind of their idea of the collective unconscious, and sort of. And so they will appreciate him. So he's sort of a bridge in that direction. Uh, but what people need, people have entertained, have looked at so many different ideas, and while trying to keep their breadth and their appreciation of different religions and different philosophies, they also need something that will save their lives, like quickly, like something that will give them what they need to face the dark times and the dark times that are coming. Where are they going to stand? Where are they going to be standing when perhaps everything will be required of them? And they're looking for that at the same time as trying to maintain their breadth and understand, you know, understand who the people of the world are in this world we share. Um, this is why I've been writing recently and experiencing recently something closer to to angelic influence, to the influence of the angels. Somewhere I intuit that the angels are moving, the angels are operating, the angels have an increased role in this time. And I don't know exactly what that means, but I do feel that that's a reality. Um, Perhaps because of the things I've been writing about the UFO phenomenon, which is such a strange
Right.
thing to
You've
be
written,
wondering.
yeah, you've written about that phenomena like way back.
Yeah, I mean, I was started writing about it 25 years ago in the system
Right.
of Antichrist, and I've just been building on the UFO chapter in that book, which has been growing and growing and getting into a bigger book of its own. And I've written some things since then, which I haven't found a place to publish, but um, it's amazing how the obsession with finding aliens or experiencing aliens, it's overwhelming in this country. I mean, it's as if we really forgot God. We cannot trust God, so we have to find something to replace him, and it is the aliens. And this is also being very intensively promoted by the government and the intelligence communities,
Right.
and for social engineering purposes. And so it's really a powerful and rather frightening development, particularly considering how toxic and deceptive and damaging encounter with these beings is, whom I consider to be the jinn, because they fulfill the definition of the jinn and their powers quite well. And so you're thinking about that phenomenon, however people construe it, the phenomenon is undeniable, and many, many, many people are experiencing it. What can one do about that? Can one do anything about that? And immediately the thought comes, this is the job of the angels, because the angels are in a higher level. See, people may understand more and more that the UFO aliens, it's unlikely they're from other planets having come through, you know, millions of light years of space. Um, but they're coming from other dimensions. That's why they're called intradimensional now, more and more. But people can't separate anything that comes from the unseen from anything else that comes from the unseen. They have no discernment of spirits where they can tell the difference in quality between the jinn and the angels. We're very
Right.
different, very different. And so I'm saying, one way that we may be called on to deal with UFO aliens is through coming closer to an intuition of the actions of the angels in our lives and in the world.
So an angelic consciousness, you're saying that this is something that's going to be manifesting.
Well, I think it is, and I think to the degree that we have fewer truly authoritative and trustworthy spiritual teachers on the esoteric level, on the true, the deepest level, as they retreat, the angels may to a degree fulfill their role. Maybe, and this is another place where I get to uncertainty, where I cannot say anything with authority, but I can tell you how I'm thinking. So,
So how about we do this? We resume this. More to come, lots more to
mhm.
come, and we can pause it for now.
Let's do that. It's getting
Yeah,
a little late here.
it's quite late for you there, and it's morning for me here. So until next time, thank you,
Yeah, till next time.
and I look forward to being in touch with you further.
Yes, I look forward to the same thing. Good to talk with you again. Always good to talk with you.
Always, always.
All
Thank you so much, CD.
right. Salam alaikum.
Salam alaikum.